This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 882 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog Fantasy. Thank you for tuning in. I'm literally giving you a free late round draft guide to try out Underdog Fantasy. Right now, the guide's available for pre-order over on lateround.com. But if you've never signed up on Underdog, you can head to underdogfantasy.com or download the app, sign up using promo code LATEROUND, make a deposit, and you'll get the guide. That guide will be emailed to you on July 1st when it launches. And you should be checking out Underdog regardless. There are tons of best ball contests happening right now at different entries, and there are other game types too. You don't need to have a huge bankroll to play, and you don't need to max enter every contest to win. There are literally contests for everyone. Check it all out at underdogfantasy.com or download the Underdog app. And like I said, when you use promo code LATEROUND to sign up, and when you make a deposit, you'll get a free late round draft guide along with a deposit offer. That draft guide's currently for sale for $19.99. It's going to be $24.99 when it does launch on July 1st. So you're getting it for absolutely free to help out your season-long drafts. And it can help out with your best ball drafts too. So one more time, underdogfantasy.com or download the Underdog app and use promo code LATEROUND. Now let's get to these mailbag questions. The first question this week is from Patreon. It's from Jack. It says, "Hey JJ, loved the work last year about first reads and RPO offenses. Based on that, is Terry McLaurin being slept on? This obviously is assuming Cliff Kingsbury calls a heavy RPO system, but Scary Terry strikes me as this year's Michael Pittman. Thanks." So last summer, I did a little work on the RPO, the run-pass option, and it was sort of a piggyback off of some of Ben Gretsch's work. And the TLDR was that there seemed to be some signal around heavy RPO teams and those teams having one or two pass catchers with really high target shares. And intuitively, it kind of makes sense. When running an RPO, you're either running or you're getting a pass off fairly quickly. You're not dropping back and typically going through progressions as a quarterback. That means the designed throw is going to a specific player, and it would make sense for that player to be the same guy over and over again, the best weapon on your team. Just last year, we saw this come to fruition once again. According to Pro Football Reference, the top 5 teams in RPO pass rate, which is the percentage of passes that came from RPO plays, the top 5 teams were the Dolphins, Ravens, Colts, Eagles, and Falcons. 3 of those teams had a wide receiver with a 25% target share per game rate. 3 of those offenses also had multiple 20% target share players, which plays into the idea that an RPO-heavy team is just heavily targeting a couple of guys in an offense. For context, 11 of the remaining 27 teams in the NFL, they were able to have 2 20% target share pass catchers. So the difference between the top 5 group and the rest of the league is 60% versus 41%. But yeah, that's a pretty small sample size. It might be meaningless. Honestly, this RPO stuff, it's all still pretty new. There's not a ton of data on it in general. With that being said, the data does date back to 2019. And since 2019, we've had 18 teams hit an RPO pass rate of 15% or more. Again, that means that at least 15% of their pass attempts came from RPO plays. Of those 18 teams, 56% of them had more than one player with a 20% target share. That was about 30% for the other NFL teams. And if you look at the teams who had a player with a 25% target share, the high RPO teams see an increase of more than 20 percentage points compared to teams with RPO rates below 15%. To put that all another way, yes, personnel is definitely dictating some of this. But there's a little bit of signal here showing us that RPO-heavy offenses seem to come with players with high target shares. That leads me to Washington. I think people assume teams with mobile quarterbacks run more RPOs. And while you'll see a trend in that direction, it's not a necessity. Look at Miami last year, or even Atlanta, or Indianapolis, who didn't have Anthony Richardson for most of the year. It's not like those teams were using ultra-mobile quarterbacks, but they finished in the top 5 in RPO rate last year. I think if anything, that may show us that individual coordinator and coaches either like RPOs or they don't. Miami has had Mike McDaniel for 2 seasons now. They've been 5th and 1st in RPO rate. Shane Steichen was in Philly as their offensive coordinator in 2021 and 2022. Those 2 seasons, the Eagles were 1st and 2nd in RPO rate. This past year in Indianapolis, despite losing Anthony Richardson, Indianapolis was 3rd. Cliff Kingsbury coached the Cardinals from 2019 to 2022. During those seasons, Arizona ranked 3rd, 1st, 2nd, and 6th in RPO rate. Last year, without Kingsbury, Arizona fell to 17th. I think it's safe to say that we'll probably see a good bit of RPO action in Washington this year, which could help their top options and potentially hurt their secondary options. Now, will McLaurin be this year's Michael Pittman? I think it's definitely possible, but keep this in mind. The Colts thought they would have a mobile quarterback last year, but then Anthony Richardson got hurt. In turn, Indy was just below average in pass rate instead of well below average. And they ran at a pace that we can't totally guarantee will happen in Washington. There's also plenty of data that suggests that rookie quarterbacks are not good for their pass catchers. That's the con side. That's the bad side. The pro side is that McLaurin's a good player who's probably playing in an RPO-heavy scheme, and Jaden Daniels is a good enough prospect to potentially break the mold. When you even it all out, I think he's basically being drafted where he should be drafted. But it's definitely a good thought overall. We shouldn't write him off, shouldn't write Terry McLaurin off, simply because he's playing with a rookie quarterback, in my opinion. This next question is from Twitter. It's from @Justin23144325. Does the MVS signing fill the Gabe Davis role, making Keon Coleman more of a viable fantasy target, or is it more of a sign that they think Coleman won't be producing and they needed a warm body? So yeah, Marquez Valdes-Scantling signed with the Bills this week. Before this signing, the Bills' wide receiver depth chart consisted of Keon Coleman, Curtis Samuel, Khalil Shakir, and Mac Hollins at the top. It's not the prettiest wide receiver group in football. They need bodies who can play on the outside in particular, and that's what MVS is. He can probably be like 80% of what Gabe Davis was for them, if not more. If them signing MVS means something bad for Keon Coleman, then Keon Coleman is in a whole lot of trouble. What I think this does is just give them more versatility at the line of scrimmage and where they can line guys up. Nothing more. MVS can be a last round dart throw if you want, because he's got Josh Allen as his quarterback and he's in a wide receiver room that's not very proven. If you want to throw that dart in best ball, be my guest. I've done that this week. But if MVS pushes Coleman off the field consistently, Keon Coleman has bigger issues. But this does give the Bills more flexibility with their wide receiver sets. This next one's from Patreon. It's from Lance. It says, among the second-year wide receivers, who do you believe will make a big leap in year 2? And how do you try to identify which of the undervalued options would be wise to try to add in Dynasty? This group of players seems to be overlooked this offseason more than ever because of the 2024 wide receiver draft class. Yeah, so in terms of identifying someone that you might want to add or trade for, I'd say the top thing that I do with year 2 players is look at the year 2 model. All of the relevant scores of the year 2 model are in the late round prospect guide. That's over on lateround.com if you haven't gotten it. In the year 2 model, it attempts to predict how well a player is going to perform in year 2 and year 3 of their career. Generally speaking, anything above a score of 95 in the year 2 model is really, really good, like elite. 40% of wide receivers since 2011 who got into that tier have scored 18 or more PPR points per game in either year 2 or year 3. This year, that's Puka Nacua, Zay Flowers, Rashee Rice, and then right on the cusp is Jordan Addison. Now, I'm not really a fan of buying into Addison right now because his peripherals weren't fantastic last year. And the chance of him being a true alpha in the league, I don't think they're high. He's probably going to be a great secondary option for years. So he's fine to have on your roster. But I doubt he's someone who's going to break fantasy football. Now, that's probably the same for Zay Flowers, but Flowers is a little bit more intriguing to me, and the model agrees. He had a 24% target share per game rate last year, and Baltimore really didn't do much this offseason to their wide receiver room. So I've bought more and more into Flowers. Puka's pretty self-explanatory. And then there's Rashee Rice. I went from being down on Rice because I had some concerns about him developing into a more well-rounded wide receiver. The Chiefs really used him as a yards after catch machine last year on those lower A-dot throws. We didn't see him as a true, well-rounded wideout. And he can still thrive in fantasy as that type of receiver in that offense. I just questioned the ceiling, and then I looked at the market, and people were already pricing him very, very high. That was earlier this offseason. And then all this off-the-field stuff went down. And I'm now to the point where, yeah, he's likely going to be suspended. And yeah, you have to question his off-the-field decision-making. But he's kind of become a value in Dynasty. So I'm okay buying into him given his year 2 score is strong. I understand the risk though, and if you don't want to take that on, you don't have to take that on. But Jaden Reed, Tank Dell, they were over the 90 mark, as was JSN. Dell in particular, that's someone whose peripherals were just out of control last year. And he has some of the best journey comparables that you're going to find in the year 2 model. They were Amon-Ra St. Brown, Cooper Kupp, and Terry McLaurin. Those are players in history who had a similar prospect score and then year 2 model score. They're guys who went on a similar journey as the player that we're analyzing, in this case, Tank Dell. And that got me very into Tank Dell this offseason. Unfortunately, Stephon Diggs hurt that, but I still like Dell. I think the most surprising player over that 90 mark is Josh Downs. Now, I talked a decent bit about Downs this offseason. I think he's a classic case of being a good player in a bad situation in fantasy. He's in an offense with a mobile quarterback who has decent competition throughout. You have Michael Pittman, now you have Adonai Mitchell, and you have a good backfield too. But I think he's a very good slot player, and I'm always fine with buying into talent. And obviously, if there's an injury in the offense, his stock can rise. So I'm going to still consider him a buy because his situation has him at a discount. Now, outside of those players over the 90 mark, the one player I'm into is Dontavian Wicks, who I talked about earlier this week. I won't get into all of that. You can listen to the episodes from earlier this week to see why. I've talked about him multiple times. But Wicks scored an 86 in the model. Typically, that means not the best things from a ceiling perspective. Since 2011, players under a score of 90 in the wide receiver year 2 model, they almost never give you wide receiver 1 seasons. But Wicks has about a 20% chance to be in that wide receiver 2 discussion. So I'm cool with throwing that dart. I think of all those players who have a shot to make the jump in year 2, if I were looking at best ball ADP and to pinpoint which players I might be targeting in redraft this year, I'd probably say Flowers, Tank Dell, and Dontavian Wicks. Those would be my value picks right now. The last question this week is from Twitter, and it is a very direct question, but also a process one to some degree too. It's from @LimLenning. It says, listen to you talking about McLaughlin earlier this week, who I love, but have seen Blake Watson get some buzz, as he's got a similar profile as Jaleel and was given a lot of guaranteed money as a UDFA. How would Watson look in your model if he went to the combine? Is he a threat? Like I said, this is a very direct question because we're talking about the Broncos backfield, but I do think it's kind of a process question too. My prospect model includes all players since 2011 who were either at the NFL Combine or who were drafted. And Blake Watson wasn't at the Combine and he didn't get drafted. That's despite the fact that he had a best season prorated reception share above 17% in college, which is a really good number. It's looking like he would have scored about a 52 in the prospect model, which seems bad, but that's an undrafted player. That's a whole lot better than most of the undrafted guys. In fact, it's a top 10 score for an undrafted player since 2011. Now, we don't see many hits in that group of 10 because we don't see many hits from undrafted players to begin with, but James Robinson is one of them. Watson's definitely the type of prospect that I'm always intrigued by. He's a pass catcher, and he could hypothetically duplicate and dig into what McLaughlin does. That would be the fear for McLaughlin. And Sean Payton's already out there comparing Watson very loosely to Alvin Kamara. So my stance here, something that you can take action on, is that Watson should be rostered in all dynasty leagues at this moment. Now keep that in mind as I get to the cons of all this. In situations like this, you also have to think about this from a team building perspective. The Broncos have a lot of good but not great backs on that team right now. There's Javonte Williams, Samaje Perine, Jaleel McLaughlin, Blake Watson, and also the guy they actually drafted in Audric Estime. Now, most teams will carry 3 running backs on game day, so 3 of those guys would probably be active, maybe 4, depending on special teams and such. And considering how much Sean Payton uses his running backs as pass catchers, like I talked about earlier this week, it wouldn't surprise me if they do dress 4. But that does mean that one of these guys might be practice squatted or just cut. They can still cut Samaje Perine later in the summer and save some on the cap. So let's assume that he's one of them. Let's assume that Perine's gone. That would leave them with Williams and Estime as sort of the bigger-bodied bruisers, and then McLaughlin and Watson as the pass catchers. And I know that Javonte Williams can catch passes too, but we're just looking at this from a high level and from a team-building perspective, and how the team might be viewing things. Of all those players, of all 4 of them, if we're just being objective right now about this, and clearly anything can change, but of those players, you have to think that Watson would be the odd man out. They drafted Estime over him. And I think they need insurance for Williams, who's on the last year of his rookie deal. I think they need that more than insurance for Jaleel McLaughlin. Like, as exciting as Watson is as a prospect, at least for me, again, I'm a sucker for pass catching backs, but as excited as we might be, Watson wasn't at the combine. He wasn't drafted. History says that players like that don't come out and give us much very often. And I know, that's literally Jaleel McLaughlin. He also wasn't at the combine. He also wasn't drafted. But just because McLaughlin happened doesn't change the overall idea here. Strictly from a probability standpoint, running backs who weren't at the combine and who weren't drafted don't work out in fantasy football at a high rate. We remember the McLaughlins and the Ecklers, but we forget about the other guys. Even if we're just talking about undrafted players who were at the combine, like Sean Tucker. And wouldn't we agree, whether you're looking at this from the team perspective or from a fantasy perspective, wouldn't we agree that the hope for someone like Watson would basically be what Jaleel McLaughlin actually showed us last year? Like, Jaleel McLaughlin is like the realized version of Blake Watson. Like I said, I think rostering Watson right now is a very good idea in Dynasty. I've done that this week. I threw that stat out earlier this week about how Sean Payton's teams own 8 of the top 20 running back target share seasons since 2011, which is absolutely insane. These running backs can be relevant in fantasy football, even if this offense is not going to be very good or projected to not be very good. I'm just trying to be rational about this. And I think McLaughlin is good. I think that he's talented, and I think that he's ready for a decent role in that offense. Watson, meanwhile, is just someone that you can stash. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you get subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. Enjoy your weekend. I'll talk to you next week.